Next presentation is from Team Massive with the title Proposal to the New Standard of Degrees of Autonomy for Mass Operations. Please welcome Team Massive.
Five, four, three, two, one.
마시모 화이팅!
Shoot!
Good.
Winner!
Winner is Team Massive. 마시모 화이팅! Good afternoon, honorable judges, distinguished delegates, and everyone. We are Team Massive. It is a great honor to present our proposal to the new standard, Degrees of Autonomy for Mass Operations. We will first suggest the overview of the presentation through the abstract, then introduce the topic with background information, analyze the issues with the RSE, and move on to the problem with the original degrees, and we will propose our final goal and conclude with the expected outcomes. Our team is focusing on two new requirements for mass operations. First, proposing the new standard of degrees of autonomy that improve the problems of the original. Second, based on the new standard of degrees of autonomy we've established, suggest a new framework for the new would-be requirements for mass operations. And we have prepared our proposal, which falls in IMO Strategic Direction number 2, and the new output was newly included for agenda of MSc 104. Now, let's start with the background information and trends in the IMO regarding mass. With the fourth industrial revolution, industrial technologies such as sensors, IoT, AI, and ICT were developed. From these cutting-edge technologies, smart ship, unmanned ship, autonomous ship, remote ship, digital ship, and connected ship emerged. IMO integrated these various concepts as maritime autonomous surface ship, also known as MAS. Here are some major research projects regarding MAS in various countries. In Finland and Norway, private companies have been the key part of the technical development. The European Union is developing methods to secure maritime safety and education in preparation for implementing mass technology. The Chinese and Japanese governments are heading projects to develop the infrastructure further. The US is introducing mass technology in military logistics market. So, why are IMO instruments necessary? The technology needs a set of agreed upon standards to be implemented, and several organizations discuss technical and safety standards within the maritime field. Atop of these organizations is the IMO, which has the power to enforce the regulatory standards. In the end, mass instruments by IMO are necessary to set a precedent for a safer and more economical maritime industry. Next, how did the discussions regarding mass progress? In MSc 95, the need for guidelines and regulations for the use of mass emerged. In MSc 98, the decision to carry out the RSE for the use of mass was agreed. Throughout the MSc 99 and 100, the framework for the RSE was approved. The first step of the RSE was completed at the Intersessional Working Group on mass in September 2019. And the second step was expected to be completed at MSc 102. But MSc 102 deferred consideration of this matter to MSc 103 owing to the COVID-19. In MSc 103, the RSE was finalized and approved the outcome. According to the outcome of the RSE, goal-based instruments regarding mass operations are expected to be developed.
To analyze the issue, we will mainly focus on the RC, the methods, the outcome, and the top priority issue. So, what is the RC? Regulatory scoping exercise was conducted to identify measures that might arise when the existing conventions were applied to MOS before MOS operations. The main objective of the RC was to assess the degree to which the existing regulatory framework would be affected to address MOS operations. The framework set up by the MSC was also implemented in length and fall for the RC of each committee. So, how was the RC carried out? Firstly, the definition of MOS was set for the purpose of the RC. During the RC, the degrees of autonomy were organized as shown. Degree 1, ship with automated processes and decision support. Degree 2, remotely controlled ship with seafarers on board. Degree 3, remotely controlled ship without seafarers on board. Degree 4, fully autonomous ship. The RC is divided into 2 steps. In the first step, the RC identified provisions in IMO instruments. In the second step, the RC analyzed and determined the most appropriate way of addressing MOS operations. For example, SOLAS Chapter 3, Regulation 17-1. When discussing MOS operations, does this instrument still stand? In the case of Degree 2, this instrument does not prevent MOS operations and thus can be ignored. In the case of Degree 3, this instrument prevents MOS operations and thus new instruments should be developed. This procedure is applied to all existing instruments for all degrees of autonomy. MSC 103 finalized the outcome, which is divided into 2 parts. The first is to amend the existing instrument, and the second is to develop a new instrument. In order to introduce amendments, the existing instruments were divided into 3 groups: high, medium, and low, based on their judged level of priority. The second is to develop a new instrument. To develop a goal-based MOS instrument, reevaluating the definitions of MOS, the terminology, high priority, common gaps, and themes for MOS operations, and developing non-mandatory instruments were identified as necessary. Among them, the definition of MOS should be considered first as the definitions as the standard when developing an instrument. Because the definitions of MOS in degrees of autonomy were interim for the RC, there are no agreed upon definitions with the end of the RC discussion since MSC 103. Therefore, further developments for instruments regarding MOS operations would require a re-evaluation of the degrees of autonomy to set clear-cut definitions in place as evident from the outcome of the RC. Incidentally, original definitions of MOS clarify that human interventions of the automated ships is ultimately unnecessary, and thus the definition can still be applicable as is. Likewise, it is necessary for discussions to take place at the IMO to decide whether to make the temporary degrees permanent or establish a new one. However, there are severe loopholes that exist within the original degrees of autonomy, and thus we feel it necessary to reevaluate them.
So now, what's the issue? We find 4 main issues with the existing definitions. Firstly, in the case of Degree 2, the definitions mention that the ship could have autonomous navigation. If the ship is indeed remotely operated, it is not clearly stated what the exact roles of the seafarers are. Secondly, in the latter 2 degrees, the ship has no seafarers on board. According to the outcomes of the RSE, because of the absence of seafarers, there are no clear distinctions between the 2 degrees in terms of their respective policies. Obviously, there are clear technological distinctions, but when it comes to policing, the distinction is ambiguous. Thirdly, while the concept of remote navigation without human intervention is evident in terms of degree 3, there is no mention of the remote maintenance of the ship. In interoceanic navigation, it is nearly impossible to take care of technical failures if the ship is stranded at sea. The new policies would have to take the concept of remote maintenance into account. And finally, there are no mentions of the engine system. In the latter 2 degrees with remote navigation, are the engines autonomous as well? For automation of the engine to occur, the ships would have to move away from the conventional combustion engines to the electronic engines that enable remote operation. It is unclear if the degrees take this into account. Now, our main idea will come in steps, starting with our new standard for the degrees of autonomy, moving on to the requirements involved in applying the standards to IMO instruments, and then to the conclusion and the expected outcome. Ultimately, this is our final goal: the new requirements for the degrees of autonomy and the IMO instruments for mass operations. First, for the new degrees of autonomy, the concepts of navigation and engine maintenance were addressed to solve the main issues. And this is what it looks like. Now, first and foremost, we've decided to keep the first degree the same as the original, as the core idea stayed the same. And degree 2 is the partially autonomous navigation ship. There are still seafarers on board and conduct the same tasks such as maintenance and otherwise operations, but note that degree 2 has navigation support by the remote operator. Degree 3 is the autonomous navigation ship. From here, navigation is conducted by the remote operator, and the seafarers are reduced to a minimum to take care of the ship maintenance with remote supervision. And last but not least, degree 4 is the fully autonomous ship. There are no seafarers on board, and navigation is completely autonomous. The maintenance is conducted autonomously, with emergencies taken care of through robots and drones. It's so great. We have the new standards, but ultimately, what we strive for is a mass code that makes these standards unofficial and referenced by conventions to effectuate the mass code and give it legitimacy. But first, we must discuss what actually effectuates mass code, the convention. Our hope is for a new Chapter 15 in SOLAS, a convention dealing with safety measures for mass operations at sea. And note here that the first part, definitions, should clearly state the adoption of the mass code and the requirements for its effect regarding mass operations. We've also come up with the framework for what the mass code would look like. The bottom half would directly link with the new degrees of autonomy. Part 1 would apply to degree 1. Part 2 would be the requirements for remote navigation technology applied to degree 2. Part 3 would be the requirements for remote maintenance technology applied to degree 3. And Part 4 would be the requirements for a fully autonomous navigation and maintenance applied to degree 4. Now, obviously, these parts would indeed have to go into much more detail, such as this. Now, we've only covered the main aspects as to address the core issues with the original. The legitimate code would have to go into much more detail with these chapters in each part. And so to conclude, we've started with the RC and its outcomes, and the direction we should be headed towards is first to redefine the degrees of autonomy, since this would be the basis for the mass code, and then to effectuate the mass code, amending SOLAS is necessary. And ultimately, the development of a goal-based mass instrument would result in mass operations.
Okay, supposing everything went perfectly well, what's to gain from this? Within a variety of expected outcomes, we wish to focus on the economic, safety, and environmental aspects. Economically, the global mass market is expected to grow from $80 billion this year to $150 billion in 2025. Domestically, Korea is expected to gain around 56 trillion won of economic benefits such as market growth by 2035. In terms of safety, maritime accidents caused by human error would decrease by 75%. Environmentally, ROK would gain the annual benefits of 340 billion won by reducing air pollutants, along with the global minimization of environmental pollution. So, this all seemed too good to pass up. But we cannot get there without first making sure mass operations become the new norm. However, mass cannot be put to use without the IMO instruments, and the IMO instruments can only be developed if there are sufficient technological and bureaucratic advancements. Therefore, the ROK should participate in setting a precedent in developing mass instruments and reap the rewards of mass. Thank you.
Thank you. For all participants, when you answer, please fully understand what the people are asking first, so that you give a proper answer. Yeah. So if you don't understand questions, please feel free to ask or clarify.
Okay.
Yep. Any questions? Peace of mind.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the energetic presentation. Regarding the mass codes, this delegate is aware that every IMO code needs to be ratified by member states, and this delegate believes that many IMO codes that has been done has a difficulty in this ratification process. So does the team have any suggestions or ideas for such ratification of the mass code?
Can you please restate your question? Thank you.
So this delegate believes that the codes that are made by the IMO should be ratified and accepted by the member states. And so does the team have any suggestions or ideas regarding such process of the mass code?
So you mean how they can convince the member states to accept the code, right?
Yes.
How?
Thank you for the clarification.
Currently, thank you for your question regarding getting the agreement of the member states in terms of the mass code. Now, currently, this topic is already a very, very hot topic within the IMO, and many discussions are already taking place and already being discussed. And because this is such a huge topic for many of the member states that are already interested, it will not be difficult in making a way to make sure that each member states get to use their technology when this mass code becomes introduced. And also, in addition, after the discussions, according to the outcomes of the RRC, it has already been established that there will be a separate mass code and a mass instrument regarding mass operations. And wouldn't that already show that the member states have agreed to such an instrument? Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification.
Any questions from George? No? Yeah.
Okay, the team Massive, congratulations. You have introduced and explained the trends of the mass in other countries. But why don't you introduce the trend of the Korean case? Can you introduce briefly the mass in Korea?
Thank you for your question, sir. Mass in Korea, the development of mass in Korea is organizations such as CRISO or Avicus, and these companies, private companies and public organizations developing mass technology to utilize the mass instrument. And in the aspects of our Korean government, we're struggling to effectuate the mass code, and we're suggesting the ideas of Korea to IMO. Yes, sir, IMO.
To add on to what my partner has just stated, So we are, in essence, a continuation of the development of mass within Korea, and we are trying to facilitate that that the Korean government or within the Korean administration, within the IMO, to continue in this direction in setting a precedent. Thank you. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yep, another question. Contagion busters.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I will start the question. Can you please explain the differences between the international regulations and international standards and industrial standards? I'm a little bit confused. And also, is there any example of a new technology being utilized by being reflected into IMO regulations? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, sir. Firstly, the industrial standards are non-mandatory standards regarding particular industry, and international standards are also non-mandatory standards which can be used in worldwide, and international regulations are mandatory regulations which can be used internationally. So the key point is it forcible or not? International regulations are only forcible and the others are not. And the second question, I can give you an example of IGF code. So IGF code was introduced to utilize the LNG fueled ship. So, and is it fulfill your question?
Yeah, that helped my question. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You suggested remote maintenance of degree 4, mass degree 4, by robot and drone. It means how the robots or drones can reach to the ocean-going vessels. That means you only degree 4 limited to coastal carriers, not for the ocean vessels. Can you explain?
Thank you for your question. The point is that the ships would already have robots and drones installed onto the ships. So it would not be about going from the land to find the ships within, on sea. These robots would have their own GPS, their own computer systems that can be reached separately from the ship. So, for example, if the ship has a GPS malfunction and on-land remote senders cannot find them, the separate computers with the separate GPS systems within the robots can be reached by so essentially it's a plan B, and these can be reached by the remote senders on land. And these robots would be the ones that can deal with the maintenance if the ship were to malfunction.
Okay, I understand. I misunderstand.
I will take a question from. Yeah.
Yes, I think it is very much future-oriented presentation. And while you are making your presentation, you mentioned about the advantage of mass, but from an economic point of view, and you mentioned the reduced operating cost, but you didn't mention about the increased cost for the new building. And considering this advantage and disadvantage, could you tell me the future of mass?
I apologize. Could you please restate your question? The last part. I couldn't hear your last part.
Considering the advantage and disadvantage of mass from economic point of view, could you tell us what is your view on the future of mass? How soon you will get it, or how soon it will be materialized, that sort of things.
Thank you for your question. Obviously, it is very obvious that within the short term, that the costs of rebuilding the infrastructure, the new vessels, is astronomical, But the point, especially with degree 4 and 3, they're very, very, very far into the future. And within the long term, when the infrastructures are slowly built and the vessels are slowly introduced into the markets, then in the future, when these ships become the majority, then at that point, operating costs will dramatically go down, obviously, because of just reduced amount of seafarers, the reduced amount of accidents, reduced amount of social costs because of the environmental aspects. All of these will add up to a reduced operation cost, and we hope that answers your question.
Yep, thank you very much. Time is up, so thank you, Team Massive. Please return to your seat. Yep.